Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone here in the room. Very nice to have a face-to-face seminar again, to be having an audience for a presentation. It's the first since a long time, so we're very happy. My name is Marleen Dekker. I'm the director of the African Study Center in Leiden. And today we have a guest from Denmark, Schouten. Peer works as a senior researcher at the Danish Institute of International Studies. And he will be presenting his book that was just published. He shared with us that today is actually the first official presentation of the book. So it's the maiden speech, so to speak. And I'm also very happy that we have Lotje from Wageningen University, who will be offering some reflections on the work that Peer is presenting. We have a presentation for about 45 minutes and a very short break for some, oh, there's no tea coffee, sorry, for some whatever. And then Lotje will kick off the discussion and we'll exchange. I think we have people online as well, Rick. Yeah, people are coming in online. So for those of you who are joining online, if you have any questions, suggestions, remarks, please write them down in the chat. We will try as much as possible to pull that into the discussion that we're having today as well. Without further ado, Peer, the floor is yours. Happy to have you.
Thank you so much, Marleen, and thank you so much for inviting me. And for everyone here as well, thank you for joining today, despite the geopolitical turmoil that we're witnessing in Ukraine, which is certainly putting a damper on the atmosphere for people everywhere in the world, I believe. And thank you again for that generous introduction. The problem is obviously with generous introductions that speakers rarely live up to them. So I will do my best. The talk I'll be giving today is based on a synopsis, or part of the synopsis, of the book Roadblock Politics, piece of the cover over here. And what I'll do in this talk is talk a little bit about the title of the book, Roadblock Politics, in the first part. And then in the second part, I will take you through the subtitle, The Origins of Violence in Central Africa, in which I'll also be speaking about the title of the presentation, Resistance and Predation. So before we get to the subtitle, let me say something about the title. What is it that I mean with roadblock politics? And to start doing that, what better way is there to bring in Heineken, talk about Heineken in Holland. So the story of this book starts in 2013 when I was a penniless grad student, and I could get a flight to Congo sponsored if I would do a bit of field work on how multinational corporations relate to security actors. What kind of security actors do they encounter in an environment like Eastern Congo? Being a Dutch national myself, I chose Heineken, of which I knew that they had about 75% share of this huge beer market that Congo represents. So I started to do my research in Goma, in Eastern Congo, and this is what you here see is Heineken's main kind of brewery in Kinshasa with a truck doing beer. And so I started doing my field work, and I expected the typical kind of setup whereby multinational firms are secured by private security companies. Perhaps they have the army or the police on its payroll to secure its premises. Until a friend of mine, Bonjean, asked me, why don't you look at M23? Now, I knew that by M23, he meant the March 23 movement, a rebel group that was wreaking havoc at that time in Eastern Congo during my fieldwork. And I asked him what he meant with that. And so he produced this receipt for me. And he said, well, you know, Heineken, in order to reach its customers, it has to deliver beer all over Congo. And I knew that M23 kind of had aggressively expanded to control trade routes, but I hadn't made the connection between Heineken's kind of necessity of distributing beer and this kind of rebel group. So it turned out that Heineken, in order to pass and deliver beer to all the villages, and its local beer is available in all the villages in Eastern Congo. It had to pass these M23 checkpoints and was systematically taxed at them. So this kind of individual anecdote, this kind of individual event raised a number of questions for me, because I had been traveling in Congo before. I did a lot of research on mining and conflict. So in order to reach these really remote mining sites, I often had to travel 300 kilometers overland on these roads, and I would encounter numberless checkpoints. But I just thought them as a nuisance, and I didn't give them a second thought. But now in hindsight, I thought, well, if this is just one company, Heineken, and just one rebel group, M23, what if you look at all these kind of different roadblocks that you find all over Eastern Congo, and all the multinationals that operate in environments like this? Because if you overlay the kind of map here of the breweries that Heineken has or had at the time of Eastern Congo, in Congo, with the kind of landscape of armed groups that operates in the east of the country, you get a question mark, actually, and that question mark I was trying to explore. And at the same time, thinking about all these roadblocks I had passed, I also started to raise a larger question for myself, which is, what if Congo's conflict economy isn't so much about control over natural resources, but rather about control over spaces of circulation, roads and rivers? Might roadblocks then perhaps also form an entry point into forms of political order that somehow remain invisible conventional frameworks through which we approach these questions? These questions set me on a journey to better understand roadblocks and their politics. Along the way, I have, together with international and local researchers, mapped almost 1,500 roadblocks in 3 different countries, using a mix of qualitative and quantitative methods, which provide the empirical scaffolding for this book. While the roadblocks in these kind of different contexts look very much the same, their politics is really, really different. I'm afraid I won't have the time to go into that too much today. So today what I have planned to do was actually to delve in to the politics of roadblocks in the DR Congo, here pictured on this side of the screen. So vast and diverse is the country, of course, that it surely merits the kind of in-depth attention that we dedicate to it today. Now, M23 only occupied the eastern part of Congo for the period of a year. Now it's actually back in a much smaller kind of configuration. But during that period, each month they made an estimated $200,000 in checkpoint taxes. And that kind of amount of revenue turned their year-long rebellion in a potentially economically viable and self-sustaining enterprise. It is for that reason that one M23 roadblock operator, it's not this guy, but someone like him, this is an M23 roadblock operator, could claim in an interview with me, here in this part of the country, the road passes through here, while pointing at this spot. Roadblock taxes were in fact so important for the rebel group that the chief of finance of the M23 rebellion complained in a memo that the activities of other rebel groups in the area were reducing traffic through M23 territory and thereby leading to a reduction of taxes. Now, M23's strategy hardly fit with scholarship of what drives conflict in this part of the region, but it was hardly surprising to locals. In this part of the world, anyone with a claim to power flocks to the trade routes, and roadblocks finance the exploits of many Central African armed groups, particularly so if, like M23, they don't control any mineral-rich territory. This is, for instance, the case for the FDLR, another notorious rebel group that I visited during my fieldwork, which here in a kind of internal memo, secret memo between different units, also complains about a reduction of checkpoint taxes because road users are reverting to other kinds of paths outside of their control. Now, of course, if you're a rebel, you have enemies, usually the state is among them, you want to remain highly mobile and intractable to your enemies. You want to be able to pack up and leave anytime possible, and yet you still want to make a profit once in a while to be able to sustain your full-time being under arms. From this perspective, roadblocks are just about the best operational strategy you can choose. All that it requires, in fact, is just this little piece of road, which you can just this little piece of string, which you can just pull across the road like this, right? And then you can just sit next to it, and it doesn't cost a thing. You know, this piece of rope is basically free. And don't worry if you don't have a piece of rope. You can also source locally from branches or pieces of trees. You can create your roadblock. So it doesn't require much of a kind of capital investment to start. And then, of course, if you're not entirely sure that you look convincing enough to make people pay up, you may also want to bring a Kalashnikov, which you can casually sling on your shoulder or just put in a corner, even if it doesn't have bullets. But even that is not really necessary. There's also roadblocks which we found which we have dubbed virtual roadblocks, whereby rebels would just sit in a village and oblige any trucker who wishes to use that stretch of road to pay. And if they don't pay, they risk being attacked later on, further down the road. These kind of virtual roadblocks don't require any kind of physical materiality of the roadblock, but they still function as a roadblock very effectively. So in a way, roadblocks, I think, are like a guerrilla's wet dream. You know, you can demonstrate power, you can make money, you can claim control, yet you can pack up and leave and just start over somewhere else if you need to. This very kind of practical consideration for the kind of rebels playbook also has implications for larger debates around the resource curse and conflict minerals. Now, this is our artisanal mining site that I visited some years ago, the gold mine site. You can see there's hundreds, maybe thousands of artisanal miners, people who generally attach a lot of value to their freedom, and they work really hard every day to just scrap together a little bit of money through hard labor. And then gold is obviously small, so it's easy to hide and to put in your pockets. And now the whole conflict mineral debate is premised on the idea that rebels and conflict actors in general would all kind of systematically flock to these mines to try and kind of control what all these people are doing, these artisanal miners, to kind of control and tax production at these mines. Does that sound easy? I don't think so. And while some rebel groups do make an effort and succeed for some periods of time, most often it's just easier for rebels or state agents to put up this small roadblock at the entry side to the mine, where everybody has to enter and leave if they want to get to the mine, and just tax the people there. So roadblocks are really much easier if you're an aspiring rebel. And indeed, it seems that they are really up there, really ranking highly in the commandments of the rebels playbook. Or as Jean, a Congolese rebel who also doubles as a commander in the army, told me, the first thing you do when you're deployed somewhere is to build a hut against the rain. And it rains even worse than it does here in Leiden. And the second thing is to put up a roadblock to get some food and make some money. Now, Jean seems to speak for all Congolese rebels. Together with local researchers, we mapped more than 800 roadblocks in just 2 of Congo's provinces, North and South Kivu. And the density there is about 1 roadblock for each 10 miles or 14 kilometers. So, and there's literally not a road where there isn't a roadblock. If you kind of create a map of just showing the roadblocks, not even the road network, you have a better proxy of where roads actually lie than the maps that are actually there, right? Produced for this area. It has been estimated that Congolese armed groups raise approximately between 15 and 50 million years exclusively through road taxes. Now that might be slightly overstated because half of the roadblocks that you see here are actually operated by the Congolese army. Given the absence of reliable salaries and logistics, every army deployment needs to be self-financing in a kind of decentralized way. But as a result, state agents and soldiers fight, of course, over these roadblocks, right? And I think there's about 15 years worth of UN panels of expert reports which provide the evidence that much of the clashes that take place in Eastern Congo actually revert around control over profitable points of taxation. So what you see overall is that you can't really see it clearly perhaps in this map, but all the kind of more dark brown roadblocks here, those are state agents or soldiers. And the red ones are rebels. And if you would kind of overlay this with the map of the road network, you would see that these state-controlled checkpoints lie on main roads, so national roads perhaps, and the rebel checkpoints, they are mostly on the footpaths kind of connecting outward from these main roads into villages or fields. So different kinds of mobility have different kinds of roadblocks. If you are a trucker, you will mostly face state agents, right? But if you're a farmer, peasant carrying things on your head, you might be more confronted with rebel roadblocks or customary authorities. So what do these roadblocks mean for people in Congo? Really, it's quite maddening, actually. I mean, imagine, if you just imagine a single roadblock, which may take about 20 cents worth of agricultural produce from you, it feels like a kind of petty subject. Why are we even talking about these roadblocks? But it's not just one roadblock, and that's the point. So if you're a woman taking your potatoes from your field to the village and then to the market, you will meet a string of roadblocks along the way. At each bend of the road, there will be one rebel group, then another rebel group, then the army, then another rebel group again. And so along this whole string, this whole trajectory, your whole journey, you will be faced with a level of predation which is stifling for agricultural activity. And the problem for people wanting to address this issue is that there's no overarching authority. There's no single center of power which steers this geography of predation that people are subjected to. And that means that once you reach the final roadblock, like this girl here coming to the market, having carried her bag of potatoes all the way to the market, when she is faced then with the final roadblock, asking her this measure here of potatoes, she just bursts out crying because it's just too much. Now, of course, given the kind of maddening ubiquity of roadblocks, there's pushbacks and there's ways around them. In the most literal sense, if you are Congolese and you live where you do, you know where the roadblock is, right? And this here is an aerial shot that someone from the UN provided for me of an FDLR rebel roadblock in an area where charcoal is produced in the Virunga Park. But if you know where this one is lying, then of course you can just try to circumvent it by making a small path through the bush. But of course you have to be very careful that they don't catch you. Now, then if you can't avoid roadblocks because you're in a truck, right, or you're on a motorcycle, it's difficult, you can't just go through the bush, then there's also ways around. Motorcycle taxi associations, typically what they do, their main purpose of being is putting together money envelopes to present to the commanders who control the checkpoints along the routes that they frequently take, as to lessen the burden of these roadblock taxes. And as a truck driver, you can also lessen the amount of taxes that you're subjected to by creating a connection to a powerful general that might help you circumvent them. And really, what we found is that roadblock taxation along these kind of paths where the government holds sway isn't haphazard or chaotic at all. In fact, commanders systematically send units of soldiers to different postings, and from each of these postings they are required to send a certain amount of money up to the commander every week or every month, depending on the profitability of the post. So here you see Congolese police agents kind of sharing the loot of the roadblock taxes that they've made that day. So given that these roadblock taxes are so heavy and that there's really a market for protection from these roadblock taxes, individual generals have started to specialize in a niche of offering protection against roadblock taxes. What you see here is the image of a laissez-passer issued by Sikatenda Shabani, who was before a Congolese general, but he has turned renegade, started a small kind of armed group. And what he did along a particular stretch of road in South Kivu was to take away all the roadblocks, but instead oblige all the truckers passing through that road, and it was really a busy road, to buy with him this laissez-passer, right? So he created a kind of roadblock fief, if you will, based on the capacity to disrupt other people's roadblocks. And of course, if you are in the army and you are raising all these taxes on these products, you realize that if you are exempt from these taxes, you can make a huge profit. So individual police and army commanders are also getting in the business of transport because they know that they can make a huge profit by being exempt from their own roadblock taxes. On this picture here, you see a truck, which is an army truck, and it's soldiers who are offloading in Goma charcoal, which is sourced from this area under rebel control. And it has passed these 25 roadblocks between this charcoal sourcing area and Goma, at which it didn't have to pay, right? So they can sell this charcoal in Goma at the same price as other traders, but they keep in their pocket the money which has not been paid at these checkpoints. Now, all of this is perhaps just of interest for people who are Congo experts or development experts or people concerned with local questions. In Congo, if it wasn't for the fact that these roadblocks have global connections, what passes along them isn't just local peasants or farmers or charcoal or minerals, but in fact, a lot of the stuff that transits past these roadblocks is part of global supply chains, are products sold by global companies. And firms like Heineken and Nestlé and Coca-Cola market their products all over Africa. And how do they do that, given this kind of landscape of roadblocks that we outlined just now? How do these supply chains work? A big part of the answer, it turns out, is global logistics companies like Bolloré. So they provide multinationals, but also aid agencies, right, with services that they call total logistics, which means that they control ports, they own the ports, they own railways, and they give you this map whereby they say, all over Africa, doesn't matter what you want, we can transport it for you. And they also offer storage, they also have warehouses, you can rent dedicated kind of corporate spaces from them. But the problem is, this map is really fictional, because far away from these kind of ports on the coast and some of the kind of bigger paved roads, Bolloré does not have an operational presence in South Africa. They can provide these services, but they do so through a layer of subcontractors. They outsource it to this inland logistics, to dedicated kind of regional companies or big national companies in Kenya, Uganda, other big countries who provide services. They have names often which are quite politically incorrect, like Imperial Logistics or the Frontier Services Group. And they use these kind of colonial tropes to sell their service, which is moving cargo where others don't dare, in the heart of Africa, right? So what these do is they create this idea of insecurity in Central Africa, and then they provide the arbitrage, which of course costs a lot of money. Now things would be great and quite simple if this is where it would stop. But these kind of regional transport companies in turn outsource logistics to national companies, right? And these national companies outsource transport tasks to individual truckers who might be the owners of their truck or just one person who owns a few trucks. So by the time that you get to an encounter of a global product, a global commodity, or aid from the UN, for instance, and a local roadblock operator in Central Africa, we are 5 layers of outsourcing removed from the global company or aid organization itself and the kind of legal person that is faced with the kind of dangers that he meets across the road and that he has to deal with. So this makes it very difficult. This kind of layers of outsourcing makes it very difficult to keep track of what is happening, right? Because truckers on the road are systematically obliged to pay for passage, and they have to do this, and they have to choose for their own safety to do so. But of course, formally, they cannot pay for these roadblocks. It's not allowed for global companies or aid organizations to pay off rebels, right? So how does this work? these kind of transport companies, now it gets a bit nitty-gritty, but it's really important to understand the connection between global companies and local conflict economies, how they are imbricated. Local transporters are required to provide bulk invoicing to their customers. So they will transport 500 crates of Coca-Cola from Beni to Mombasa, and they can only provide like an invoice for the total cost of this cargo. So there's no breakdown in terms of fuel, there's no breakdown in terms of personnel costs, but there's also no breakdown in terms of roadblock taxes. But of course, their client knows that these roadblock taxes may constitute anywhere between 25 and 50% of the total cost of transport, right? So what many logistical companies do is that they create this kind of parallel bookkeeping, in which they require these transporters plying the road to provide evidence of the roadblock taxes that they incur throughout their journeys. And they do so in the form of these kind of stamped waybills. If you do fieldwork yourself in some parts in Central Africa, you may also have to get it stamped at every place you go, or by this kind of manufactured rebel receipts. And that allows companies, transport companies, but also their clients to kind of keep an eye on how big these roadblock taxes are, and it's quite sophisticated in some cases. So what you see here is that the very way in which roadblock taxes are hidden inside global supply chains means that for rebels, there's no incentive to stop taxing these global supply chains, because it is not being monitored officially. Nobody is keeping an account of it. So they can basically get away with structurally taxing global actors and take to the road becomes a kind of sustainable business model for rebels in Central Africa. So what I outlined now was, in a nutshell, what I mean when I say roadblock politics. What I want to do in the second half of this presentation is zoom out a little bit from this kind of anthropological present and take a big historical view to put into perspective how we can understand what this means in the context of the kind of political history of Central Africa. And here I want to start out by just imagining or feeling what kind of huge space we're talking about. This is from Gabon, right, on the Atlantic coast, all the way to Uganda, this vast space covered by this huge equatorial forest, the savannas around it. There are spaces which are inundated 60% of the year, like the South in South Sudan here. So this is a huge, huge area. And for many outside observers, Central Africa is kind of endemically home to failed states. And there's always rebel groups everywhere. States don't control their territory and their population. And my argument is actually that politics here isn't lamentable or messy for not extending across their whole territory and covering their whole population, but instead, there's a rational form of politics going on, a kind of rational mode of state making, which eludes the usual frames we use to approach it, as it is premised on the ambition to obtain exclusive control of a territory and population, this frame. And there's two parts to the problem I have with that kind of framing of state making as usual. The first is about the ambition, and the second part is about territory and population, spatial kind of argument. Now I want to start here with my hero, Jan van Sina, whom some of you may know, whom I believe to be the first to suggest that in the deep history of Central Africa, there weren't many centralized states, not because people somehow weren't capable of forming large polities, they weren't advanced enough to do so, but rather because people consciously tried to keep the centralization of power at bay because of their fear of enslavement, forced labor, and other ills that they saw occurring in these more centralized polities closer to the coasts. And I can quote him here. In fact, he states that the ability to refuse centralization while maintaining the necessary cohesion among a myriad of autonomous units has been the most original contribution of Western Bantu tradition to the institutional history of the world. So for him, a key defining characteristic of the political history of Central Africa is this drive towards autonomy and this resistance towards the centralization of power into any kind of chief or place. Now, for those of you who are familiar with them, you might recognize the astounding similarities between what Jan van Sina here posits and what Pierre Clastre wrote about the people of the Amazon, or for that matter, James Scott for the people of upland Southeast Asia. So my first problem with the idea that there's no meaningful politics outside of the ambition to establish centralized states is that instead perhaps people in Central Africa have over the centuries developed sophisticated political cultures premised exactly on keeping forms of centralized power at bay. Now this kind of political history is still largely to be written, and I hope to do so perhaps for a next book. But it is important to recognize this alternative political logic if we are to make sense of the kind of turbulent history of conflict and state formation in this vast region, including, as we will see, how we understand the politics of roadblocks. My second problem is with this idea that states are only meaningful if they cover a territory or if they control their whole population. Now, this prism is so dominant that it doesn't require much elaboration, but I just want to underscore how central it still is to how people perceive politics in Central Africa. Jeffrey Herbst, in his kind of seminal treatment of states and power in Africa, writes, and I quote, "States are only viable if they're able to control the territory defined by their borders." Now, such similar kind of precepts have been used again and again to construe contemporary Central African states as failed or failing. And of course, read along these lines, Congo and the Central African Republic, another country I look at, South Sudan, don't really score very high. I mean, in Congo, there's more than 20 armed groups. The Central African government doesn't control proverbially much outside of Bangui, its capital. And it's quite interesting that even rebel groups, not only states, but rebel groups are scored according to that same kind of logic. A very influential recent volume on rebel governance proposes that, and I quote, "Rebel governance at the minimum means the organization of civilians within rebel-held territory for a public purpose." Of course, you can see that's exactly the trappings, the familiar trappings of the state that are projected into rebel governance, right? Territory, population. Absent these, so goes the argument, no meaningful form of governance can be spoken of. Now, from the perspective of aspiring rulers, faced with this huge Central African space we've outlined here, scattered populations, often quite mobile, does it make sense to try and control all these vast expanses of rough terrain? Deploy soldiers at every little hamlet, even though there isn't much to administer or tax? And on top of that, you run the risk that when they hear you coming, they will just scatter and disperse, as happened to so many colonial administrators in Congo and Central African Republic. Of course, Central Africa isn't alone in being endowed with this kind of rich geographical possibilities for eluding the state and the difficulties posed to state making. But swamps such as the South here, mountains, rainforests, form huge obstacles for the ambition of states to kind of control their territory and population. That was, of course, the central tenet of James Scott's book. But the point that I'm trying to make is what kind of form of state making does make sense in this kind of area, in this kind of environment. And I try to do so for the entire historical period for which evidence is available, roughly from 1500 or so. And of course, the kind of history of the region, the evidence that's available, comes from these European explorers that from 1500 onwards start to penetrate the continent, reaching deeper and deeper along these kind of caravan and long distance trade routes. And this history of long distance trade starts to intensify by the 19th century, when the demand for commodities like ivory takes a huge leap in Europe, and at the same time the price for producing the stuff that was traded for it in Europe, beads and fabrics and so, starts to drop radically. So you can see that the value that's concentrated in the trade starts to increase enormously in the 19th century. So how do Central African communities deal with this kind of intensifying of these caravans? There's now caravans coming into Central Africa, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of porters, a huge disruptive kind of influence that they can pose on local communities. And what happens is that, I mean, of course, in this region, stuff has been traded for a long time, iron, salt, anything, but this has been passed from hand to hand between different kinds of communities, embedded into relations of friendship. But now what happens is that people from the coast start wanting to trade directly in the interior of Africa, bypassing all these middlemen. So in response, these kind of decentralized communities in Central Africa start levying transit taxes. They start levying a transit tax, which in East Africa, in the trade language that emerged in the time Swahili, was called hongo. Hongo. Today, hongo means bribe, but back in the day, it meant a transit tax. So what you really see is that the accounts of explorers in the 19th century are basically just a boring accumulation of descriptions of these encounters with hongo or transit tax levying communities that they have to face as they try to explore the interior. Obviously, they often travel on the back of well-established caravans anyway, so there wasn't much exploring going on. But this is basically what the situation boiled down to. So in the 19th century, the levying of transit taxes becomes so important that it turns into one of the main factors of state formation along the trade routes where the trade goes into Central Africa. I try to illustrate this on the basis of two major routes into Central Africa. On the one hand, the Congo River, where communities like the Teke and the Bobangi further upriver start to manufacture exclusive control over strategic points of passage, from where they can tax passing traders or prohibit them from further advancing and overtaking the trade that otherwise would be carried on by strangers. And the Bobangi control all these major points, these major strategic points along the Congo River itself, and other communities which sit on the branch rivers are then prohibited from trading on the main river, but they in turn control trade over these branch rivers. So there's a vast system which is emerging in the 19th century along this major trade route. On the other side of the continent, things are even more fascinating because there's more detail, empirical detail available. What you see here, this is the kind of main pre-colonial highway for caravan trade into Central Africa, reaching to Lake Tanganyika, is that all the communities who live along these major kind of trade routes, and it's an assemblage of routes really, but all taking this kind of same direction, all start specializing in living in hongo, transit tax. And some communities which don't even live on the road move from the mountains down from security towards the road, so they can also participate in this very lucrative taxing of caravans coming from the coast. We have amazing empirical detail available for one area, Ugogo, in what is now Tanzania, where a PhD student in the 90s mapped from all the historical evidence available how the levying of hongo spread like a wildfire to all the kind of chiefs in Ugogo, and it started to turn into the fact that everybody who was taken serious as a chief was a chief by virtue of his capacity to levy hongo. And in the records provided by people like Henry Morton Stanley, who professed that he went mad because of these hongo taxes, we learned that at each of these kind of hongo levying polities, about 3% of the value of such a caravan was taken. So in this kind of deep history of roadblock politics, because that's what it is, state formation and the levying of tax on goods from the outside, on outsiders, was a key factor of the transformation of political authority in the 19th century. in this way, actually, it's important to underscore that Central Africa wasn't unique. This is a map of London in 1850, and at the time in the UK there were about 8,000 toll gates or turnpikes where trade was taxed. And in the same way in France there were about 4,000 toll gates and checkpoints that we knew of, which was the essential manifestation of the state. Before capital became concentrated in production, capital was concentrated in stuff on the move. And states basically restricted themselves to taxing this moving surplus where possible. So important was it that whole novels have been written about the disruption of trade taxes. This is an illustration of the novel Michael Kohlhaas, which is a novel, a German novel from the 19th century, but it's actually about a nobleman in the 16th century who goes mad for being overtaxed by the king of Saxony and revolts, right? Disrupting the whole political order in Saxony. If you don't like old illustration, it's actually made a movie with Mads Mikkelsen about it, so you can kind of get into it in a modern way. But all jokes aside, levying taxes on trade was the basic premise of state formation. But this kind of history, the centrality of trade taxes in state formation has been blurred out by a subsequent fascination with territory and population as the main kind of vector of state formation. Early colonial efforts traveled with these explorers along these routes dominated by Hongo polities, people levying transit taxes. So the kind of earliest Free State administrators and people helping Leopold II to establish what would become the Congo Free State traveled along these communities levying transit taxes, saw how profitable it was, and started dreaming of overtaking them. And indeed, along the Congo River, which we saw before, Camille Coquilhat, what he does is he strikes deals with Pobangi rulers, like him over here, to take over these points at which they would take trade taxes and start levying trade taxes themselves. Of course, those local rulers who didn't want to comply were attacked. But basically for like a decade or two, the only thing they were doing was what the African rulers had done before them. They basically copied the African model of control and started levying trade taxes. On the other side of the continent, along this kind of highway we saw from Zanzibar, Emil Storms travels into Central Africa. He meets, I don't know, maybe 100 Hongo levying local rulers. And for him, he writes in his diary, the basic premise of political authority in this area is Hongo. And so when he reaches into Congo, what he does, having recognized in Hongo the mark of sovereignty, is signing these deals, these papers, with local rulers, in which they literally, and it's written down in each of them, pay Hongo to Emil Storms, and thereby transfer to him the authority over territory, right? Because for Emil Storms, it's a bit messy in terms of state and control. And so by paying Hongo to Emil Storms, he takes Hongo, uses it, appropriates it to kind of form the very kind of seedling, the start of the Congo Free State in this area. Nowhere is this connection between early colonialism and roadblocks as evident as this image from the Amsterdammer, the Groene Amsterdammer, from 1890, where Leopold II here is depicted as operating a roadblock. The early Free State was seen by other countries who were denied access to trade into the interior as a tax-raising roadblock state that could deny and stop trade and tax it itself for its own good. So trade taxation was really the foundation of the Free State. But Belgian Congo subsequently heavily invested in transport infrastructure. And by doing so, they, of course, fiercely reduced the possibility to manufacture power out of the friction of terrain. They prohibited entirely local communities from levying transit taxes. And instead, mobility, transport became something internal to the administrative and infrastructural tract of the colonial state. And this period is really the heyday of what I call infrastructural empire, in which transport equalizes power. There's great quotes from colonial documents at the time, and I'll see if I can just find one to illustrate for you. Yes, there we go. This is the Belgian Ministry of Colonies. Transport infrastructure has a political importance of the first order, in that it enlarges the efficacy of sovereign power, whose invention it renders easier and faster, and which turns it into an active reality. The official who governs, the missionary who evangelizes, the soldier who maintains order, see their action increased tenfold by the mobility afforded by transport infrastructure. In other words, as a kind of other colonial officer put it, colonizing is transporting and communicating, right? So control over the kind of logistical space of an area that you're trying to dominate is contingent upon control over transport and logistics. So even the kind of territorial basis of the state, control over people and territory, goes through controlling mobility. And here I basically make an argument about the political geography of conflict, right? About what are the conditions for roadblock politics? And if countries control their whole transport network, if transport networks are governed from end to end, then it's very difficult to manufacture power locally out of the capacity to disrupt trade. But until the 19th century, until the Industrial Revolution and the Transport Revolution in particular, states never had this kind of control. But this period in which states did have this control in Central Africa is already gone. In Central Africa, not only Congo, but also Central African Republic and many other areas in the world, I would say, the infrastructural power of the state after countries became independent has drastically reduced. In Congo, this happened because the roads here were all maintained by forced labor. When Congo became independent, people stopped maintaining them because, hey, no more forced labor, yay. So 60% of the road network disappears. And mismanagement by Mobutu, structural adjustment, further reduce what was 152,000 kilometers of road to a fiction on the map. And once again, in the 1970s, 80s, you see pockets of resistance bubbling up here and there, and it becomes possible for people to manufacture power out of the capacity to disrupt trade. Of course, underpaid state agents in Mobutu's Zaire didn't have much else to do being posted somewhere than just setting up shop by the road and taxing people's economic activities. Here is just an impression of the road network as it is now. I just want to fast forward to this image. Rebel roadblocks is one thing. There's another category of roadblocks that I want to end with. And we have labeled them community roadblocks because we didn't quite know what else to do with it. This is a group of youngsters. This is an image from last June when I was traveling in Ituri, of youngsters from the Babila who have made a roadblock, and they say they're maintaining the road, but they're not, and they just demand everybody to pass. And most people do so because they know that, if you don't pay, they might have some connections with the Mai groups in the area, so it's better to just be in order. And they mostly ask truckers coming from the outside to pay, NGOs, people from Beni, what they call black Wazungu, like the black outsiders actually. So what you see bubbling up, not only here but in other parts of Congo as well, is these community roadblocks which aren't defensive, they aren't offensive, they're not hostile, but they are a way for communities to a kind of frontier of resistance against the kind of nefarious impacts that trade, concentrated capital, aid might have in their territories. So you see roadblocks emerging again as a kind of political stratagem to force a bit of redistribution of wealth coming from the outside or passing through, keeping control for communities of the kind of impact of outside trade. So what I've tried to do in these almost 50 minutes, sorry for that, is I try to demonstrate what happens if you look at the world through a lens in which trade, logistics, mobility, and transport are key vectors of political order and its contestation. I've tried to illustrate those so through the case of Congo, but I do believe that the story I'm trying to tell here also holds for other places. Central African Republic, South Sudan, Somalia, maybe perhaps Libya, the Middle East, Afghanistan. So there's potentially this huge swath of the world in which states don't control their trade networks, the conditions under which trade is done, and where people are able to manufacture power, contest the order of the state, where rebellion can be funded, decentralized, out of the local capacity to disrupt trade and to tax the circulation of goods, peoples, and commodities in motion. So I hope I haven't bored you too much with this story, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions, comments, and suggestions. Thank you so much.